Is it possible to live under a violent and coercive regime without dirtying your hands? And after that regime falls, how do you look at your colleagues and neighbours who enabled or even participated in the violence? These are some of the questions asked by Ed Stanton's novel Frail Blood. Set in Buenos Aires in 1990, it dramatises life in the aftermath of military rule through a tempestuous love affair. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama and poetry. In each episode I invite an author or expert to give their views on a particular work of literature, and today I'm joined by Ed Stanton to discuss his novel Frail Blood. I hope our conversation inspires you to read it, and if you have anything to say about the text or the topics we covered, please leave a comment. And if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Ed Stanton is author of no less than 14 books, some of them translated and published in Spanish, Arabic and Chinese, as well, of course, as English. He's been awarded grants and fellowships from the Fulbright Commission, the National Endowment for Humanities and the Spanish Ministry of Culture. To give further details of just two of his books, his environmental novel, Wide as the Wind, was the first to address the tragic history of Easter Island, and it won the Next Generation Indie Book Award for Young Adult Fiction, as well as 3 other international prizes. Vidas, Deep in Mexico and Spain, received the Grand Prize Bronze for Best Travel Writing in the 15th Annual Solas Awards. Today, though, we're discussing his most recent novel, published in April this year, that's 2025, which is Frail Blood. It's a pleasure to welcome Ed to the World Literature Podcast. Ed, thank you so much for joining me on the World Literature Podcast. Great to be talking to you about Frail Blood. Could you begin just by saying a little bit about the novel? What's it about? Who might be interested in reading it?
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for having me on your podcast. Frail Blood is a novel that came out this year. It was published on April 22nd, which was the 40th anniversary of the trials of the juntas, or the military regime in Argentina. It's a love story that deals with a recently divorced American journalist who kind of escapes to Argentina, Buenos Aires, as being the country that's farthest away in the hemisphere from him. And he's a 30-something journalist for the Los Angeles Times who specializes in Latin America, so he knows the language and he knows the region. But he's never been in Argentina, and he leaves Los Angeles on the spring equinox, and he arrives in Argentina the next day after the autumnal equinox. It's kind of symbolic of the way things are topsy-turvy, everything is backwards. And he soon meets a 20-something medical doctor named Gabriela. His name is Robert. She belongs to a very powerful Anglo-Argentine family. They fall in love, and the love story becomes complicated by Gabriela's family because her father has been complicit in the military regime of the 1970s and 1980s. The novel takes place in 1990, so about 6 years after the end of the Civil War. And before we go any farther, Yvonne, I think we should make it clear the terminology. The dirty war is the term that has been captured by the international press and has been used over and over. It's a very catchy phrase for the military dictatorship in Argentina between 1976 and 83. But this was a term that was actually used by the generals and admirals, by the members of the regime. So it's been denounced by the opposition, the people who suffered under that regime. So we should probably refer to it by some phrases that maybe are not as catchy, but are not as complicit with the regime, right? Some people have talked about a civil war, but there really wasn't a civil war because you need two militaries for a civil war. People have simply called it the military dictatorship. The juntas, also the Argentine governments after the military dictatorship, called it the campaign of state terror, which is not a phrase that exactly rolls off the tongue, right? So I'm simply going to call it the military regime. So Robert falls in love with Gabriela, but that love becomes very complex in relation to her father, who was complicit with the regime. And soon the novel becomes a kind of a political thriller as well as a love story, and kind of an exploration of the relationships between love and power. And I think it's a very timely novel. When I started writing it, I had no idea that the United States and Argentina in the 2020s would elect new presidents who were not only friends, but also political allies, and both of whom I think are aspiring authoritarians or simply authoritarians, and who have both attempted to kind of rewrite the history of their own countries. Donald Trump has tried to rewrite the history of the January 6th insurrection by turning those insurrectionists into heroes. And Javier Milei, his friend and political ally, the president of Argentina since 2023, has tried to revise the history of the military dictatorship through what he calls total memory. In other words, trying to remember also not only was the military guilty of violence, torture, and disappearing people, but also the other side, the Peronists, the people on the left, the Montoneros. They also kidnapped and tortured, not, however, on the vast scale of the military regime.
Thank you. Thanks for that very thorough yet succinct introduction to the novel and to the context. You mentioned complicity a few times there. This is my own particular academic interest, so if you'll allow me to dive right in with that topic. But I think also because that context hangs so heavy over the novel. I think it's so the novel is set after military rule. And you have these questions of justice and amnesty in the years following, this kind of trade-off between a desire for justice on the part of the wronged, yet also the need for some degree of forgetting in order for life to continue. Interesting, you just mentioned Milei and this idea of, is it total memory?
Complete memory. It's
complete memory. Almost the opposite, but that kind of becomes a form of forgetting, perhaps. So how do you think Frail Blood deals with these questions? Was it something that you wanted to approach directly, or were they kind of naturally there in writing a novel about Argentina in this period?
I think they were naturally there in a long time that I spent in Argentina at the time the novel takes place in the 1990s. And this question of justice and forgiveness, or justice and mercy, is one that other countries have dealt with. And I'll just mention the two cases I know best. One is Spain, which had, of course, the Franco dictatorship from 1936 to 1975 or 6. And the Spaniards opted for what they called the Pact of Forgetfulness, el Pacto del Olvido. And it was kind of an agreement among the parties on the left and right, both those who had suffered under the dictatorship of Franco and those who had supported the dictatorship, to let bygones be bygones and to get on with the transition to democracy, which worked quite well. There were a few steps backwards, especially in February 1981, but it worked, and Spain has become, I think, the 9th most powerful economy in the world. It has a functioning democracy, a member of NATO, a member of the European Union, etc. But that Pact of Forgetfulness has come back to bite the Spaniards decades after the transition in 1975 or 1976, when mass graves started to appear. And they had to kind of revise that. And some Spaniards joked and said, we need to forget about the forgetfulness, right? This drama is shown recently in the movie by Pedro Almodóvar, Madres Paralelas, Parallel Mothers in 2021. And the other example would be Argentina, who, instead of opting for a pact of forgetfulness, they immediately responded, but quicker than any of the other countries. In South Africa after apartheid, and then Chile after the Pinochet dictatorship, after Northern Uruguay after its dictatorship during the same period, Northern Brazil in its dictatorship earlier. So they immediately established this Comisión sobre la Desaparición de las Personas, CONADEP, the Commission on Disappeared People. And a massive 500-page detailed, well-researched report came out very soon after the end of the dictatorship. I think it came out in maybe 85, 86. It was, the lead author was the well-respected Argentine writer Ernesto Sabato. And in 1985, you had the trials of the members of the military regime, some of whom were jailed, and some are still in jail. Some were pardoned later on. This is shown very well in the movie Argentina in 1985, which came out, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, won some nominations for Best Film, International Film, Global Awards, etc. So those are the two examples. And how has it turned out for Argentina? Not as well as it has for Spain, but that could have to do with the nature of the two countries, the culture of the two countries, rather than the process of either forgetting or remembering, right? And in the novel, I try to deal with this issue rather than abstractly through the characters. And I'm trying to show the kinds of nuances in this dilemma between justice and mercy. One example would be the Julio, Robert's friend, who has lost a son under the dictatorship. His son was tortured and killed in a terrible way. And yet he is a Catholic. He's a practicing Catholic. And there's some sense that he believes in mercy. He also has young children and a wife that he wants to protect, so he's a little bit afraid of pursuing vengeance because he knows who's responsible for his son's death. So, and I try to show the role of the church here also, because we know that the church was also complicit with the dictatorship, which had an ideology of Christian nationalism, if you want to call it that. And this, by the way, was a real dilemma that Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, suffered from, because he was Bishop of Buenos Aires. And many people believe that one of the reasons that he became, in his later years as under the papacy, such a compassionate person and forgiving person was because of the guilt he felt for not doing enough to help the disappeared and the victims of the dictatorship when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and later he was in another part of Argentina. I hope that answers your question. Maybe the answer was too long.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Really interesting details coming through in a lot of the context you're giving there. Fascinating details about Pope Francis as well. And you talked about the novel approaching these issues through character. And I think the novel does a great job of showing these kind of shades of kind of different levels of pressure, kind of intersections of institutions, but also social connection, just kind of happenstance of who you know as well. One of the sort of larger than life characters, I guess the largest character is Gabriella's father, who, is involved in the regime. And at one point he says, these hands are clean. And a moment later, I'm responsible but not guilty. What kind of distinctions between responsibility and guilt do you think can be found in general? I think perhaps also, if we bring it back to the novel, is that something you've been keen to explore? And again, also taking it to another level, I mean, we just talked about the role of the church. What about art and literature? Do they have a role to play, either in the moment or in this process of reconciliation or failed reconciliation, whatever comes after? Sorry, there's a lot in that question. I hope that's enough to, that's not too much to work through.
There is a lot, but I appreciate good, well thought out and thoughtful questions. The question of responsibility and guilt is not something I really set out to write about or to consider a theme in the novel, but it's something that I started to observe in my many months of living in Argentina. And in the case of this larger-than-life character, and he really is, his name is Cesar, which suggests a kind of imperial personality. His first middle name is Roca, which means rock, and then his British his maternal last name is Steele, with an E on the end. You don't want to make it too obvious, right? So his name kind of tells us about the character. He's a very powerful character, extremely intelligent. He was complicit in the regime. He ordered at least 2 deaths, one by torture and the other by an even perhaps more terrible way of dying, by having someone thrown from a helicopter over the Rio de la Plata, the River Plate, with arms and legs shackled, and obviously killed by the impact of the water, and that person sank to the bottom of the river. So he definitely is responsible for ordering several murders. He says his hands are clean because he didn't perform the murders himself, but he might as well have. And he doesn't feel guilt, even though he's a believing Catholic, because of his conviction that what he did was necessary to defend his country and defend this kind of Christian nationalism and patriotism. And also, he doesn't say it, but we see in the novel, to defend his own social class, this very privileged Anglo-Argentine class that built the railroads and built the refrigerators to store the beef, and built the telegraphs and the telegrams. The British did a lot of important things in Argentina, right? So he is responsible. He doesn't feel guilty. I think this is very subjective, Ivan. It's from the point of view of the reader and the observer of Robert, he's responsible and guilty. But from his own point of view, he is responsible but not guilty. It kind of reminds you of the old famous line by William Butler Yeats, right? Not that the best lack all conviction, but that the worst have passion and intensity, right? And this is something we see in the novel and in the Argentine situation. There's a great scene in the last, at the end of the movie Argentina 1985, which deals with the trial of the juntas. And after the generals and admirals had been found guilty in the courtroom, and the witnesses who had testified against them, who had lost sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, etc., either through torture, murder, or being disappeared, one of the generals looks into the camera and says to the witnesses after the trial and after that general has been convicted, and says, "Hijos de puta," sons of whores, you bastards, right? In other words, completely unrepentant, right? And we have found this in many of the admirals and generals because they really believed that what they were doing was necessary to stop the rise of admitted kidnappings, demonstrations, strikes, murders that were carried out by different organizations on the left. So you do have that dilemma. I don't want to use some kind of equality between the two sides, because I think the historical record is pretty clear that the government did much more damage and certainly killed and disappeared many thousands more people than the other side. But this is what art can do. This is what fiction can do as witness, and can show through a character the complexity of the issue, rather than stating some kind of universal principle or an abstraction.
Yeah,
I probably
absolutely.
forgot part of your that multiple layered question. Did I forget some part of the question?
I think you managed to cover most of the bases, actually. Yeah. Thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit about sense of place, because I think the novel really, conveys a very clear sense. This is Buenos Aires, right? Could you maybe begin by reading a passage for us from the novel, and then on the back of that, I'll ask my question.
Good. I'll do that. And the passage I'm going to read, it's a short passage. This is the scene. The lovers, Robert and Gabriela, are exploring Buenos Aires on foot. And it is one of the most beautiful cities in the world to explore on foot, because it has such a vibrant street life, wonderful cafe culture, probably second to none. Maybe that includes Paris. There's always activity on the street, wonderful cafes, restaurants, what the Argentines call confiterías, bars, tea rooms, 24-hour bookstores, cafes that are open 24 hours a day, a vibrant street culture. And this passage tries to capture that in the aftermath of the military regime 6 years later, when the country is again suffering from terrible inflation. And the two words in Spanish that your listeners should know are verdes, which are greenbacks or dollars, and the other one is the austral, which was the short-lived currency in Argentina after the dictatorship. It's a beautiful name for a currency, austral meaning for the South, right? I think it's the most lyrical name for a currency that I know about in the world, but it only lasted a few years because of the terrible inflation, right? So those are the two words that the listener should know about. We're in November, which is like spring in the Northern Hemisphere, right? November days shimmered with golden light. Buenos Aires appeared as a colossal spectacle for Robert and Gabriela, one they seemed to view sometimes with a single pair of eyes. On corners and in metro stations, they watched musicians, dancers, puppeteers, and mimes perform. On avenues and streets, they saw strikes, protests, and parades by labor unions, priests, and political parties. The Popular Front, the Communists, the Trotskyites, the Peronist Party of Justice, the Anti-Peronist Radicals, the Anti-Peronist and Anti-Peronist Movement for National Dignity. They combed streets and plazas, fleeing money changers who accosted them in search of verdes, skirting lines of irate customers who thronged around ruined banks, watching businessmen punch their calculators to compute the latest plunge of the austral. On sidewalks, they leaped over puddles and dodged crater-sized potholes. They saw weeds opening cracks in the streets and paint peeling like snakeskin from walls. They witnessed Buenos Aires collapsing around them, hoping that it would survive so long as they sustained it with their love, so long as it provided the scene of their enchantment.
Thank you. Wonderful passage. I think my question's about sense of place, but I think I'll add into this the next question I was going to ask as well, which is about the style of the writing. So, I think some of the descriptions of the vibrant street life you just mentioned, I've never had the good fortune to go to Buenos Aires, but, I think that passage captured it. How does that sort of vibrancy, how does Argentine culture, as it's lived, in the kind of day-to-day, how do you think that intersects with the kind of historical and political issues that the novel addresses? Is there something that about those events that really specifically sort of came out of Argentina, in Argentine culture, do you think, or is that maybe a bit of a stretch to make that connection? And again, adding more onto my question here, but also, could you say a little bit about the style of your writing? Because I think the novel is very dramatic. We have action, we have intense emotion between these lovers who, fall in love, immediately embroiled in these kind of political plots. So again, does the drama kind of come out of that particular location as well, do you think?
I think it does, and sometimes when you get a good question like yours, the author thinks in a new way about his own novel. And as I think about it now, I think about the drama of life in the street in Buenos Aires. And if you think about probably the most well-known and maybe one of the most powerful images of the resistance against the military regime, of course, are the famous madres and abuelas, the mothers and grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. This plaza in the heart of Buenos Aires, right in front of the presidential palace, where these mothers and grandmothers of disappeared and tortured and murdered victims of the regime have marched for 4 decades, rain or shine, against opposition, often against harassment, often, and it's a weekly drama every Thursday afternoon. It's gone on for 4 decades, and it's street drama. It's a theater on the street. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but I think it'd be hard to find a situation similar where a drama played itself out over a period of years, year after year, with this tremendous juxtaposition and conflict between, on the one hand, the people marching in the Plaza de Mayo, and right there, yards away, is the presidential palace, where sometimes members of the military regime would shout insults out of the window at the mothers in the street. So thanks for asking the way you asked that question, because it gave me a new kind of insight about the novel and life in Buenos Aires. Sometimes we get so close to our own writing, Ivan, that we lose perspective. And the great Argentine novelist, Julio Cortázar, who has one of the greatest novels about Buenos Aires called Hopscotch, Rayuela, said that when he was asked what was most valuable in his work, and he said, whatever is valuable in my work is what I'm not aware of. It's what came from my subconscious, right? And we all hope that that can happen to us. So before talking a little bit about style, I want to go back to the sense of place again, because I don't think I answered that question. I read the passage, but that was partial, right? Because there's a lot more about place. So some of the neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, really, I tried to develop almost as characters in the novel. So you have Palermo, the green area of parks and mansions and beautiful homes and apartments, where Cesar lives, where Gabriela's father lives, right? And the kind of privileged area of the city. And the most radical contrast with that are the Villas Miseria, or the terrible slums on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, as they are in the outskirts of most great capital cities in Latin America. And then inside the city itself, you have Recoleta, which is another elegant neighborhood with famous centenary cafes and tea rooms. But it happens to be cheek by jowl with the cemetery, with the church and cemetery, where the best and the brightest and the greatest and the most powerful in Argentine history are buried, starting with Evita, right? Evita Perón, right? It's been said that the most expensive real estate in Argentina is in the cemetery. And so really, those are just a few examples of how I tried to make some of these neighborhoods almost act like characters in the novel, in the sense that the people who inhabited those neighborhoods express the economic, social element of the neighborhood where they lived and where they acted. As far as style, Ivan, I think the style makes the book in any case. And I've gone through periods of American minimalism and tried to go beyond that style. And I think what I try to do in writing books is to make the style match the moment, or make the style match the situation, obviously. But there is that kind of Hemingway-esque minimalist American strain in my writing. But I also really believe that only works when there are moments of release, and when you open up to a much more, let's say, Latin American or Latin American boom style writing, the great Latin American novels of the 1970s and 80s, right? Where you had this tremendous use of the imagination, the flights of of fancy, unreal characters, surreal situations. And I tried to pay homage to that tradition very much through some of the characters, especially Virgilio, who is this hunchbacked enigmatic character who dwells in the bowels of the Turkish baths of a hotel. And this is a real place, by the way. And where he can almost predict what's going to happen in the future. He's kind of the trickster figure, the coyote figure. Also, he is probably the most comical character in the book. He ends up being not so comical. He tells wonderful jokes to Robert, and he ends up being one of the most important characters. But for me, he was a character that could have appeared in one of the magical real novels of Garcia Marquez, Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, Isabel Allende, all these wonderful writers in the Latin American boom. So those are kind of the influences on my writing. I think on the one hand, a kind of American Hemingway-esque minimalism, which can be very powerful, I think, an understatement. And at the same time, that influence of the boom novels and the new Baroque in Latin American literature. And I try to combine those two elements. I don't know if it works, but that's what I was trying to do.
Great. Thanks for those insights. And yeah, interesting to hear it tied to, the American minimalism. So going to the north, and we'll talk about Robert as an American shortly, but also, of course, the Latin American tradition, the magical realism, as you mentioned. So I think this would be a good time to take a break. So please do join us, everybody, for part 2, and we'll continue to discuss Frail Blood then.